the one challenge that we currently see, I think often is like, suppose like you have a like really cool project and I was the funder, and now there's like somebody who does like an impact assessment. Both of us have only an interest in like having kind of a positive review. Like you as a project want to hear that it's good. I as a funder, I also want to hear that like I funded the right thing. There's no incentive for truthful evaluations.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's conversation is with Holke Brammer of Hypercerts Foundation. We discuss making retrospective funding a norm using Hypercerts. Now, I know that's a bit of a word salad, but I think there's some really powerful ideas in here, because if retrospective funding becomes a norm, then prospective funding, the way we typically fund projects, could fundamentally change. In this discussion, Holke shares what are Hypercerts? What is the core idea and set of principles here? We talk about the three main actors in an impact marketplace, how to better align financial incentives and risk, and what are some of the potential unintended consequences and downsides with this system. This discussion can be fairly heady and technical at times, but you can go to hypercerts.org to prototype and get a better sense of what's being discussed. The conversation was recorded at ETH Denver in March 2023. I hope you enjoy Holke Brammer. We're here today with Holke Brammer, who is a research scientist at Protocol Labs and a founding member at Hypercerts Foundation. Welcome, Holke.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start from the top. What are Hypercerts?
Yeah, so a Hypercert, you can probably just imagine that it is something like a carbon credit, but generalized to any impact vector that you can imagine, if that's biodiversity, if that's open source software, or AI safety. So it is this a similar concept applied to those things. And why we think that is important is that with that idea, you really can have a record of like what is work that is like impactful or like supposed to be impactful. And we want to have a record of that in order to reward these, like the contributors to this work, either like prospectively or retrospectively, so that whoever actually produces impact, like public goods or like impact on like positive value for the environment, that they actually also get rewarded for that according to the impact that they create.
Got it. So this is really about creating financial incentives, recognition, better accountability structures, markets where they didn't exist before. Am I kind of describing it?
Yes, yeah. And it's actually a combination of that. So it's not only like the funding, but the funding is important because like you need funding actually to do the project that are impactful. But it is also about like the social recognition, that we actually give transparency to like where's actually the stuff happening that creates kind of the world that we really want to live in. And then not only rewarding those who contribute directly to it, but also to reward and make transparent like who is actually funding this work.
Right. Okay, so I want to unpack all of that, but first maybe just zooming out. So my understanding is this was a research effort that started at Protocol Labs, and now it's in its own Hypercerts Foundation.
Yes.
And there's a number of contributors. Who are some of the folks involved here?
Yeah, so basically it all started, or like actually the idea of impact certificates in general is like an older idea that also came from like in the effective altruism community. That's where like that was discussed quite a bit. And then at Protocol Labs, Davidat, a research scientist, he then like thought about it in like fairly rigorous terms of like what does it really mean to account for the work that is impactful, and how do we want to really build a system out of that. And then we kind of tried to develop this idea and tested it out. We kind of presented the first ideas at Funding the Commons, which is a conference series, and got a lot of like interest in this concept, and a lot of projects kind of want to use it. And then we at Protocol Labs developed the idea further, and then basically created now the Hypercerts Foundation, so that it doesn't stay as like a research project, but it actually becomes a reality. And that's what we want to do now at the Hypercerts Foundation, which is a nonprofit, to really build kind of this as a like public infrastructure, as a public good in itself, so that a lot of projects can use Hypercerts. And the idea is also that it's something like an interoperable standard, that if you have a Hypercert from one project and from like a different project, or like from different platforms, so they actually work together, so that we have like a coherent and consistent impact space, as we call it.
Right. So I was introduced to the concept at the Funding the Commons event in New York, and I listened to Davidad speak. And what strikes me is that there's like this consistent philosophy of openness that's underpinning the way you talk about it, the way he spoke about it. And even just at the time, it was like, here's the idea, and we need all of these developers and all of these community managers and all of these types of roles. And so to see the progress, even just over the last less than 12 months, is pretty phenomenal. And I understand Super Modular, Kevin Owaki is also working with you on this. Raid Guild is also a part of it. Yes. You have a great episode, by the way, with Kevin on Green Pill, so people could check that out. Okay, so is the notion of a Hypercert any different than an impact certificate, or is this just kind of a new brand or label, or what is that distinction?
So it's I would say it's a specific implementation of the idea of impact certificates, and I think something that really distinguishes it from other implementations of impact certificates, or what we think is really important, is to disentangle the contribution and like kind of the work that has been done from evaluations. So the Hypercert, like the basic Hypercert, just says like, okay, this was like the work that has been done. It doesn't actually say something like 5 tons of carbon has been removed from the atmosphere, but maybe just like, 200 trees have been planted. And then as in the second step, we actually can have evaluations that point basically at the same space and the same thing that was captured in the Hypercert, then attributing really evaluation and impact towards this work. And this enables really like a dynamic environment of like different evaluations from different evaluators, or from the same evaluators over time with different methodologies. We might actually learn and develop new methodologies to evaluate impact. And all of that is like only possible if we really disentangle this, like a contribution graph of like the impactful work, and then how we evaluate that and say this was impactful, in order to then create kind of a reward function to, okay, this was impactful work. How do we actually, as like a community, as a group, want to reward this financially, but also from like a social standpoint?
So what I hear you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the Hypercert itself is more of like the input, like the 200 trees planted, and then the evaluation is more of the outcomes.
Yes.
And it could be multivariant, or it could be that you're measuring carbon over here, and someone else is measuring biodiversity, and someone else is measuring land area conserved. And so is all of that information in those different outcomes still attached to the same Hypercert?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is like a different dimension where we can also disentangle that, but we don't have to. How we think about it in terms of a Hypercert is that there's kind of the scope of work. So what have you actually done? Like 200 trees were planted. And you can say, okay, this Hypercert actually captures all of that impact. And that can be impact on CO2 in the atmosphere, but also can be impact on biodiversity. And if we basically say the scope of impact is all, then whoever kind of owns this, or like has created this project, and the Hypercert who owns that Hypercert, all of that impact is in that Hypercert. But we could also create 2 Hypercerts out of that. One that basically says, okay, this just represents the CO2 captured, and then another Hypercert that focuses just on the biodiversity aspect, or we can also just say it is everything but the CO2 captured, so that we could have different funders. Like one funder might be interested in the CO2 aspect of it, and another funder would be interested in the biodiversity aspect. And this is important because there might be two different projects that capture actually like the same amount of CO2, but one is much better for the biodiversity than the other project. So if you have like direct CO2 air capture, that might actually not actually like be positive for biodiversity. So we actually want to account for all the impacts. And if you have positive impact on both dimensions, then you might as well get rewarded for both positive impacts.
Got it. Love it. Okay, so I want to keep unpacking that, but first, also, I'm super curious. How did you end up in this space, in this work? What's your background on all of this?
I've done like quite a few different things, but there's also some kind of a coherent theme to it, I think. So from my training, I'm a political economist. Did my PhD studying kind of democracies and how do we get good long-term policies in democracies. Then I didn't go into academia, but made an exit to management consultancy. Didn't stay like too long in that. Went to do a secondment at Uno Social Business. So that is a philanthropic venture capital fund. I didn't work on the funding side there, but I worked on building new corporate social businesses together with like corporate partners. So for example, like a plastic recycling factory in India, or I worked on healthcare in Kenya. And that's what I did for a year as a secondee from the consultancy. And then afterwards, I quit consultancy work, but then did some pro bono work, and then ended up in kind of like, it was like quite some serendipitous moment right at the beginning of COVID. The NGO that I just did some pro bono work with, they started with like 600 other organizations, a hackathon. And this hackathon turned into like the hackathon of the German government on COVID. We had 28,000 participants in this, generated 1,500 ideas from basically from how do we track and trace COVID to how do we support small businesses applying for state support towards challenges around domestic violence. And we produced the community, these 28,000 people, produced 1,500 ideas in just 48 hours. And then this kind of led me to further work with the NGO, this project together in Germany, to create a 6-month program to support 150 ideas out of this. So this was kind of the space of social innovation in between civil society and the state, and also bringing in businesses and other bigger players, because the idea was really how can we leverage the innovation power of civil society and many who have amazing ideas, but if they are not a for-profit business idea, then it is really difficult to scale them up and bring them where they have the most impact. And that's where we see the combination of bottom-up with top-down institutions, so that the state is able to scale them or support them and bring them really to the effect that they should have these ideas. And that was really fun work. Did that for 2 years. So after this first process, we also had a second process where we showed that this methodology, which we call open social innovation, is not only a tool for a crisis moment, but it's also a tool that can be used for a lot of challenges that states are actually it's difficult for states to really solve them alone. But in combination with the population, with civil society, with other actors, they can actually find solutions. So that's kind of the second process that I supported in Germany. And that then led me to some extent to discussions with Evan from Protocol Labs, who runs the network goods team, about how do we really think about financing these social initiatives and public goods in general. And then I was drawn to the Web3 world with like, how can we really build new incentive models? Because that's kind of like the design space in Web3 is so big. And we can build new systems that really change and challenge the current way of like different actors in society working together. So it's different new coordination mechanisms, but also funding mechanisms that we can test out, and there's a willingness to test these out. And then when we test them and prove that they work, then also connect them with established players and change the way we actually like solve problems in society. So it's like I changed organizations, but like the mission is still the same, and I still like in conversations with Project Together in Germany to think also how can we combine these threads from like Web3 and Hypercerts with the work that we have done there, and the work continues on like the big challenges of like they have like the Farm Food Climate Challenge, climate change in agriculture. But also working on the Alliance for Ukraine, like how can the civil society in Germany, together with the state, support kind of whatever we can do in the current conflict to like circular economy, and how can we really reshape how we work in a circular fashion.
So what I'm really curious about is, from those experiences where you saw government, civil society, in the flow of funds, the incentives, what makes you believe that can be improved? Where does Hypercerts fit in? Because I think some people looking into Web3 from the outside are still trying to understand, like, how does it solve any of those fundamental issues? And then maybe that can help lead into some of the other mechanics of how Hypercerts works.
Yes. Very complex question, because it's like what is kind of wrong in the world today, and like how can Hypercerts actually help with that? But I think fundamentally, like a lot of the things where we think about Hypercerts enabling retrospective funding, like we have retrospective funding today already with like prize competitions or social impact bonds. So it's not something that is like completely new, and like we came up with a concept that wasn't possible before. So we have instances of retrospective funding already. But what we really want to see is to have these models scale much more and make them much more easy to use. And this is also something where Web3 still has to like make the user experience actually much easier, that it really is for everybody very easy to use. But what is interesting about Web3 is that it really lowers the transaction cost of doing all of these things on scale. So if you just like have like one project and you want to do retrospective funding, like Web3 will not really like help you that much. But if you design a system where you have Hypercerts that cover a lot of projects, where you just use kind of the same mechanics over and over again, and you want to have that very transparently as a public record of work that has been done, because it's also like work that it has like, or should have like a public positive impact, then we create a transparent system. We create one that can be used over and over again. It is permissionless, so it can be used from different players. There's not one platform that kind of captures the mechanism. So it's not that we think of like creating kind of a Amazon for impact, where it's like, oh, everybody has to go through our platform and we like acquire some kind of like market power, but that like it is a primitive that can be used by different platforms, and the platforms then kind of compete to have like the best user experience, to have the best evaluations, and we really get a diverse ecosystem that funds impact, and that is what Web3 enables, because now we can not only like have those interactions between kind of content creators and content consumers, but you also have kind of the trust in the system, and you can kind of own these certificates without kind of an intermediary that says like, yes, like this person owns this person owns this, but it is like built into the infrastructure that we can build up this trust.
Got it. So a lot of the same benefits that we hear espoused about blockchain is really what you're describing, right? By using a common ledger, we're able to create these money Legos that effectively can help disintermediate a lot of inefficiencies and create some shared language and patterns and protocols to build from in order to accelerate the fluidity of these markets, the transparency of these markets, and so forth. But it's done with permissionlessness, openness, open source, presumably, all at the core. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
So let's walk through an example of maybe where this is going, and talk a bit about my understanding of this three-sided marketplace that you're all trying to kind of help bring up as part of this effort. So, who are the main actors in this, and what's the kind of flow look like?
Yeah. So we can think of kind of three categories of actors, which are kind of the contributors that do the work and create a project. Then the funders, and there can be two types, prospective funders who enable it in the first place, but then the retrospective funder who reward kind of the impact after it is observable. And then the third actor is evaluators, and they can also be more prospectively, so scouts who find out new teams that are have a promising project, but mainly we are thinking about it as auditors who look at the impact that has been created and try to see who is actually responsible for this to reward it retrospectively. So these are kind of the three groups of actors. And then if we have a project that set of contributors have a really good idea of this is a project that is likely to have a positive impact, then this project can try to attract prospective funders and get the money that they need in order to actually make this project try it out, because there are also a lot of projects in the public goods sphere that probably don't happen because they have a small likelihood of success. And now I'm entering a small tangent, but it's kind of the high potential, high risk projects that are currently not really funded. And when you look at for-profit startups, we see so many startups fail, but in the public goods space, we currently fund probably way too many safe bets, or funding too many safe bets, meaning we don't fund enough risky bets, and risky meaning just that they don't have they shouldn't have a negative downside, but the chance that they don't have the positive impact.
Yeah. So if I can pause you there, because you've described so many of the challenges I see in the kind of philanthropic nonprofit funding space as well, the impact investing space. So you give money to a nonprofit, you can't necessarily see what the impact is. Best you get is maybe an impact assessment report at the end, but obviously there's not really any incentives to say anything but the most glowing reviews. And then there's no shared system of how we're measuring that or what the accountability mechanisms are. And then when we make a philanthropic investment or donation that works and it created a lot of value, there's actually not really, we know maybe, but no one else really knows. So there's no scoreboard, so to speak, which means that there's not a lot of shared learning that can come from that as easily. And then in the impact investing side, you get entrepreneurs who are doing phenomenal things, maybe sacrificing some of their financial return accordingly. But because everything is still just through the lens of financial results, it's hard to tell the difference between an impact investment that actually just the company wasn't that effective versus one that's actually making a tremendous impact, but maybe was foregoing some of those ROI metrics. And so what I'm hearing is that there's this new, we're trying to kind of instrumentalize a new layer of value exchange or value creation with these hypercerts.
Yes. And I think you just mentioned some really good points here already. And just to stress them, the one challenge that we currently see, I think often is suppose you have a really cool project and I was the funder, and now there's somebody who does an impact assessment. Both of us have only an interest in having kind of a positive review. You as a project want to hear that it's good. I as a funder, I also want to hear that I funded the right thing. There's no incentive for truthful evaluations. But in the world that we want to create, at least part of the funding is dependent on the evaluation. So now if I'm a retrospective funder, I really care about like what are the evaluations that I can look at to distribute my money to the most effective projects to reward them, because that creates then the incentives downstream that really like drives the whole system. And then like because the retrospective funder cares about the evaluations, now the evaluators really have to come up with quality evaluations, and in the system you have to make sure that these evaluators are also rewarded for this. So I imagine that there should be kind of a business model because now we really care about quality evaluations. Let's take some part of the funding and earmark that for evaluations, because in the bigger picture, this will then enable kind of a learning feedback loop that we will find out like what actually works, what was the most impactful, and advance those methodologies much more than like, the methodologies of like impact creation, but also about like the impact evaluation, like because there's so much and like there's actually so much that happens right now, but in the coming years we will be so much better of like measuring biodiversity and thinking through like what is the real impact of research on AI safety. Like we will be able to be better at putting kind of value in that and compare it, but only compare it like between similar kind of projects. So like we will not be able to like compare the impact of open source software from like biodiversity, but in a biodiversity domain, we can compare that. So I think that's like the evaluation that you pointed out is a challenge right now. And the system should be designed that it's really like a dynamic environment where evaluators can thrive and funders can access those evaluations and then make good decisions of how to distribute their funds.
Right. So what I love about this is what you're saying. So there's the people who are doing the work, doing the impact. There's the people who are funding it, investors, philanthropists, governments, whomever. And then there's the evaluators. And what you're saying is by having this retrospective lens, what we're effectively doing is, so if I'm a funder and say, I want to fund biodiversity results, and I see 100 impact evaluators who have gone off and said, here are the quality biodiversity projects, and I choose 3 of them, then I'm sending a signal in terms of who are the quality evaluators. And so there's actually a marketplace or an incentive mechanism, and now a push towards higher and higher quality and rigor at the level of the evaluators. And what I find particularly compelling about that is not only the new financial incentives that accrues, but right now, a lot of those evaluations tend to be regulated by the state into their roles, and it tends to be fairly monopolistic inside whatever niche you're discussing. And so it ends up also having all sorts of perverse incentives because of that structure, whereas this, I'm presuming, kind of takes it out of that back into the open marketplace.
Yes. So it really depends on who are the retrospective funders.
Right.
Because the retrospective funders, the evaluators create signals for the retrospective funder. If the retrospective funder is just the state, we basically end up in a very similar relation. But if we are also able to decentralize kind of a little bit the decision on retrospective funding and have like multiple foundations, or create kind of, it's still kind of state money, but we enable the population to be part of making the decision, or like crowdsource some wisdom on how to like which evaluators to trust, or like use the evaluators just to inform kind of the crowd. Then we get into a system where also the power is like much more distributed than if we just like have one big retrospective funder. But even with like retrospective funder, if we have like multiple states or something, it is already interesting to see who, like having an open evaluation system and an open decision mechanism from the state, where we can actually like see why the state decided in this or that way. That would be like progress already.
Sure. And I want to emphasize the point you made earlier about the risk curve, because my experience is that we definitely don't have as much risk taking in the philanthropy and government space at the early stage the way we do in the venture capital space, right? And because in venture capital you need 1 out of 10 to hit a home run, and maybe you're golden. Whereas in this space, there's just a lot of conservative behaviors that set in and creep in because you don't want to waste anyone's money. You don't want to waste taxpayer money. You don't want to waste donation money. And so you don't want to take necessarily big swings that fail. So what you're suggesting is that this model could help unlock some of that risk-taking. Can you say anything more about that?
Yes. So, and I think that there are actually some foundations who do a great job at
Totally.
today already. So it's like we're
overgeneralizing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also in the way that some actors, like for example politicians, have kind of a risk aversion that comes out of like the incentive that they actually have, and like so it's blame avoidance that they try to achieve, which is totally reasonable. But then we should let other actors that can actually take the risk, and that can be like foundations that really specialize on like, let's find the next big thing in public goods. Let's really find the stuff that is unlikely to succeed, but if it succeeds, it really has a positive impact. And they make the bets on like new teams, and they really like it's a division of labor and specialization on this. Finding these teams and then also helping them, because then they actually have an incentive to help them and help them succeed. And then a funder like the state comes in, only just like looking at the results, and they have a much easier situation to like really like see, okay, these 9 basically just failed, and this one is like really successful, and then just fund this one, and also reward kind of the early funders who helped this project to succeed. So it's like a similar way that we think about like the division of labor of like who finds the kind of the next thing and who takes the risk, and those don't need to be the same actors, and even those two roles can be evaluators that act more as a scout, and then a prospective funder who takes risk, and then the retrospective funder who, without a lot of risk, funds the good things and really sets all the incentives for the whole system. And to add like another point here, if you really want to have this system perform in a democratic way, then this retrospective funder, we should have some democratic principles because they really like shape the whole system of like who do you actually prospectively fund. You do that in expectation of the retrospective funding. So if the retrospective funding has some legitimacy through democratic processes, then also the prospective funding is legitimized through this.
So I'd love to bring it back to an example. Maybe we start with the 20 trees or 200 trees that we're planting. So the person planting the trees is doing the work. Walk me through, so the funder could be an investor, it could be a foundation, it could be an individual donation, it could be a school, right? So I guess it's somewhat indifferent in terms of the system of Hypercerts works the same. And then there's the evaluators, and we mentioned someone that might evaluate from a carbon perspective or someone that might evaluate from a biodiversity perspective. So where this, when we wake up 3 years, 5 years from now, like how does that potentially work?
Yeah. So from the perspective of the project and the contributors, ideally you would know that if you do something that produces positive impact in the future, you will get rewarded for this. So
I open my app and I see that for every tree I plant, I can make $5.
So it's basically because the vision is that retrospective funding becomes a norm, and we like with carbon credits right now, it's kind of regulated so that we actually know that there will be funding for carbon credits in the future, and we can like for biodiversity, if we have enough retrospective funders who promise that they will in the future reward those who increase or like have a positive impact on biodiversity, then a project that today thinks about, hey, I think I have something really cool how I can contribute to biodiversity, to other positive impact. Then if you know that, then you can just like go out and do the impactful thing, and don't like your first step is not looking for funding, looking for a grant, writing a grant application, waiting for the result of that, maybe trying another one, and then at some point you get some funding, but then when you get some of the funding, then you actually have to do exactly what you wrote in the grant application. And again, making a comparison to the startup ecosystem, we know that to succeed, you need to pivot your idea. Your first idea is not the right one most of the time. So you pivot and you change it. The grant application oftentimes limits you in how much you can pivot. But if you know that you get rewarded for the impact later on, you can actually like pivot and try to really maximize the impact, because that is what really counts in the end. So we want to kind of free up the individual contributor and projects to really focus on the work and the impact. That is kind of the world that we imagine, and like then that world would ideally also attract much more talent to this area, because like applying for grants and stuff like that is not the stuff that entrepreneurs really like are too keen on. They actually want to build, and they want to produce impact. So freeing up kind of their talent is one of the goals from the perspective of the contributors. From the perspective of the retrospective funder, they would then basically just like look at different evaluations, and there might have been some established evaluations for biodiversity, so it can be quite standardized, but like the standardization emerged out of the system itself. And then they look at that and distribute the funding based on that. So, and it is like the uncertainty is quite reduced. And from the evaluator side, they actually can have a business model. They like from the funding, maybe like 1 or 2%, or like in some areas it might be higher because the evaluation is can be quite expensive. But like there's some percentage earmarked for the evaluators, so that they can actually provide professional evaluations and get rewarded for that. So that's kind of from the different perspectives of the three actors.
Right. So what I hear you saying is, let's make retrospective funding the norm, and so that culturally is something that becomes more and more adopted, so that the people on the ground doing the work have confidence to be able to actually focus on the work that they're doing, and a different incentive structure and alignment around how they're funded to do that. And funders have more confidence in both having more data, more transparency, more plurality of evaluation models and so forth, to be able to see inside of who's getting the results. Yeah. And validators also have potentially financial incentive to participate that's not relying on necessarily a different intermediary, but actually just the network itself.
Yes. So you mentioned that retrospective funding becomes the norm. I would say retrospective funding becomes a norm. Because we still need all the other funding instruments. So we want to have grants, we want to have milestone bounties, we want to have retrospective funding, and they are useful for different types of positive things that we want to see in the world. And you mentioned earlier already, like inputs and impact, and like from the theory of change, from like all the way, like sometimes we want to, we know exactly what we want. There's no uncertainty about what we want. We know that something has a positive impact and we just have to do it. Then we can just give out a grant, or if we want to incentivize like that behavior specifically, we have a milestone bounty. But if there's no uncertainty resolution over time, then we don't actually need the retrospective evaluation. Because it is interesting if in the future we will look at the work differently than from today. If we don't look at the work differently in the future, we don't need this complex system of funding it only afterwards. So that's why retrospective funding is only useful in certain cases, where like there's uncertainty resolution over time. And then retrospective funding is also able to be combined with other things. So we can think of, you start your work with a grant, and your retrospective funding doesn't pay for everything, but it's basically just an impact bonus. And that is also a world, like a first step towards maybe more risk taking from kind of public goods entrepreneurs, that yes, your costs are covered, but you get an upside if you really are successful and create the impact that you want to achieve. So there's like a combination out of from all of this, and what we imagine is that, or like the vision for Hypercerts is really that Hypercerts work with all of these kind of funding mechanisms, because if you create like impactful work that's funded by a grant, you can actually mint a Hypercert for that and award your funder for that. So he has like some social recognition for that. And then also for milestone bounties, you can apply this as well. So it's Hypercerts is really like a data layer below all of these funding mechanisms that like work with different decision mechanisms and different funding mechanisms, and also allows future different funding mechanisms to work with Hypercerts as well. So it's kind of agnostic towards the funding mechanism, but it's most useful, or we are most excited about currently about like the ability to enable retrospective funding.
Got it. It makes sense. And taking the carbon and biodiversity example is quite interesting, because we have carbon, which has a fractured but developed or developing sets of marketplaces that have interactions with different nation states around different, like where I live in New Zealand, we have an emissions trading scheme. I believe where you are, there's regulated carbon markets, and other places there aren't, which affect the prices and everything else. And then now you have this phenomenon of everyone going, oh, well, let's create biodiversity credit markets. And oh my gosh, I mean, a ton of carbon is hard enough to actually overly generalize across all of these systems. But when you start talking about biodiversity, you have it must be a plurality of approaches and locally specific, because the ecologies are fundamentally local, right? And so what drives biodiversity in New Zealand is completely different than where you are in Germany or where we are in Denver, Colorado,
yes.
Right? So what we're suggesting here is that the notion of an open marketplace in this way you said it, in passing, where the standards will emerge from the system itself. And so am I understanding it correctly that, if we take the biodiversity example, that different localities and places can, like, I'll be able to go into the system and say, this is my biodiversity Hypercert outcome that I'm validating or that I'm funding, and that it'll effectively be a competition of ideas and legitimacy and rigor and everything else for these things to emerge? Or are there and of course, obviously, who funds it and who evaluates it? And so that it's just kind of creating a marketplace for this?
Yes. And so not only a marketplace, but we can also then think about how do we want to coordinate this together? Because different funders could actually come together and say, hey, let's develop some common ontology, some common language around biodiversity. For example, in New Zealand, like what do we actually care about? What do we want to measure? What techniques can we use to measure it? How can we make this comparable? And we can agree on some of those things.
So we'd have scientists, Department of Conservation, philanthropists in New Zealand get together, say this is what we think are some starting ways of measuring and monitoring biodiversity, and then what would their engagement with the Hypercert system be? It would be help me understand that.
So basically, you could then create kind of a template for like biodiversity assets. So this is like how we want to have biodiversity represented in a Hypercert. So because it's like different things are relevant then for open source software. So when we then have biodiversity here, and we want to have then some methodologies that kind of the funders really like choose what kind of the signals are like the most valuable signals, and then people can actually come up with like additional like improvements to the methodology and kind of like create a discourse around that with evaluators, with funders, and then funders make potentially new decisions and the next time they decide on what projects to fund, so that we have a continuous improvement around this. And something that enables that probably is really like finding also a common language around this. But like the language in New Zealand might actually be different than in a different region, because there are different things that we really care about. So, and it is then about like trust. Who are we trusting to come up with this? And if we have like competing standards, that can be also very productive, because then like over time we will really see like how do funders really decide between like the different standards, different methodologies to evaluate things.
Got it. We could go on about this. I do want to shift a bit, but yeah, my mind is spinning. I know there's a lot more we could discuss on that, on the mechanics of how this all works. So what I would like to ask is, how are we thinking about the potential unintended consequences or downsides of these types of systems? And some of the thoughts that immediately spring to mind is the, potential over-financialization of things that are currently more in a qualitative sphere, a reductionist approach to things that may leave people's contributions behind. So, for example, those 200 trees I planted. Well, who did the seedlings, and who fed me lunch before I came and did the planting? And like, there's communities that are always embedded in all of our relationships. And so, do we risk over atomizing and over financializing and over reducing these types of behaviors, and then creating new perverse scaled incentives of, but if I hurry up and just do that, then I make all this money? And then so yeah, walk me through how you're thinking about some of these considerations.
I think there is, if we take an approach where we just say, this is like the one measurement that we care about, and like now let's focus all of our attention on this like one measurement, then like we basically know that will go wrong. And it's also called like Gotthard's law, that like if you really like orient like a system to like just one measurement, this measurement will not be a good measurement anymore. And I think what the ideal setup would be that we create transparency around what we evaluate, because it is really about having a discourse about what we value as a society, as a group, as a community, and then aligning our systems towards that. So currently we have a financial system that is aligned towards certain things, and it is not what we really value. And making this much more transparent and public, what we evaluate and how we distribute the funding, enables us to actually prevent exactly the risk that you just like pointed out. But if you have like just like a narrow mindset to this approach, then all of the risk that you say can happen also in this system. So having an open, transparent dialogue around the evaluations, what we care about, and the dynamic improvements of those, that is necessary to really push all of this in the right direction.
So what you're saying is that it's really about the principles of transparency, openness, making sure that we can redesign our activities in coordination towards what we care about and what we value, and currently have a system that directs a lot of that attention and energy one way. And what we're saying is that these types of approaches of what we're building with something like Hypercerts is going to improve that system fundamentally, is the theory, is the hope. Right?
And beyond just like having this open discourse around it, we can also improve on the decision-making mechanisms around this. Right. So if you think about the way we can actually now aggregate kind of the opinions of many people much more easily with the technology that we have, and like there is like experiments on participatory budgeting that is similar to what we actually do here, or like that can build on Hypercerts as well, that we really enable lots of people to weigh in to the decision, and that they then also represent the things that they value, not only as like in an open dialogue, but really with like decision-making power. We can think of having like democratic voting mechanisms on that. We can experiment with quadratic funding quadratic voting and quadratic funding that we do in Web3 currently, and like apply that to more things. We can also look, how do we kind of discount for kind of those people who are oftentimes overrepresented in decision-making mechanisms to align the kind of the outcomes more with a broader consensus. And innovating in that space is also something that is kind of exciting, because we see a future where we can coordinate with the technology that we have in a way different manner than we have so far. And like, also to give another example here, is like citizen assemblies, where you just like take a sample of the population, and this sample really gets informed about like what is like really the issue that we want to solve, and then makes an informed decision about this, but represents like the whole population. Could be also an interesting mechanism to put into like the decision-making mechanism for how to allocate this funding.
Love it. And there's so many more threads that we could go into around DeSci and AI alignment, and I know that the world is we're barely scratching the surface here.
Yes.
Are there any other additional key points or calls to action, and also, please, how can people engage in this discourse and start getting their hands dirty with it?
Yes, I think like the point that you just made around like there's DeSci and ReFi and like so many projects that actually do really cool work, and there are also like so many cool projects that already think about how can they incorporate the idea of hypercerts in their projects. And that is probably like the thing that really excites me the most, that like it's not just like, oh, we have like one project that like wants to change all of these things, but it is an idea that is already like a lot of people are running with this and have their own ideas and apply this to different things. And that really, like, you can see already that a dynamic ecosystem around the idea of hypercerts is being created, or like, I mean, it started with impact certificates, so like it started earlier than hypercerts. And that is really exciting. And how people can engage with this is, I mean, on hypercerts.org, the website, there's also a link to a Telegram group where we are currently kind of coordinating all the people who are interested in advancing this. And that's where like all the news will be shared as well, how to get engaged, how people can use hypercerts, how can people build on top of hypercerts, and get engaged in like the overall ecosystem.
Great. Well, listeners can find the links in the show notes for both the website and the Telegram group. Yes, thank you again, Holke. I'm super excited. It takes a while to wrap one's mind around these things. I feel like I'm still just trying to grasp, and it's been months since being introduced to it. So, but because we're so early, it's a good time to really engage in the conversation and prepare for what this is going to mean. And I think especially, from a funding perspective, I can imagine that this is going to solve a whole slew of current challenges and tensions that are going to get people really excited.
Yes, and the current engagement is also interesting for us, because we need to know from like different projects what is actually what they need from kind of this primitive to really build what is useful for a lot of projects. So it's a kind of also a kind of user feedback from projects that want to use it or build on top of that. That's super helpful. And then there are like so many new ideas. And we also want to have like a lot of different approaches that are tried out. Because like, as I said earlier, like the first idea is not exactly the right one, and we have to like pivot and change it a little bit here and there to really find the exact same thing, the exact right thing that really works. And that's what we are excited about, that a lot of people are thinking with us on these topics.
Terrific. Great. Well, thanks for sharing it with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. What do you think of that discussion? I feel like hypercerts could be critiqued as being overly limiting or too instrumentalized. but I do see that it can address a wide range of issues, especially within the philanthropic and social enterprise space, as it pertains to impact measurements and feedback loops. And so if the UX becomes improved and some of these cultural norms take place, I do think that this retroactive funding or retrospective funding could be a powerful new trend in the future. You can learn more and play with these tools at hypercerts.org. You might also be interested in checking out our conversations with Alan Ransell from Filecoin Green and Protocol Labs, as well as Kevin Owocki. Links are in the show notes, and anytime you can go to maearth.com to see all of our episodes and conversations. We are a new interview series, and so we're also eager for your feedback. Please leave us a comment, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you on the next one.